Blood dripped from Sarah's hands as she finished removing the bullet from the Apache boy's side, unaware that 50 warriors were already tracking him to her isolated cabin. At dawn, when she saw their painted faces surrounding her homestead, she knew her act of mercy had just placed her at the center of a war she never chose to fight. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The storm rolled across the Montana territory like God's own fury, painting the sky in shades of charcoal and midnight blue. Lightning split the heavens with silver fingers, illuminating the rolling grasslands and the solitary cabin that stood defiant against the wilderness. Rain lashed against the wooden walls and tin roof, creating a symphony of drumbeats that had become a familiar lullaby to the woman who called this place home. Sarah Holloway stood at the window, watching the tempest with quiet reverence. At 32, her face still held beauty, though time and hardship had etched fine lines around her eyes and mouth. Her chestnut hair, once the pride of Boston society, was now simply braided down her back, practical for the life she led. She wore a simple cotton dress, patched at the elbows but clean, her hands calloused from work that never ended. 3 years had passed since she buried Thomas, her husband of 8 years, in the small plot behind their cabin. Pneumonia had taken him in less than a week, leaving her alone on the frontier with nothing but their homestead and memories. The nearest town, Redemption, was 2 days' ride to the east, and in the 3 years since his passing, she had made the journey only when absolutely necessary. "Just you and me again tonight," she murmured to the orange tabby cat curled on the windowsill. Rusty purred in response, seemingly unbothered by the storm's violence. Sarah moved away from the window, stoking the fire in the hearth. The cabin was modest but well kept, one main room with a wooden table, 2 chairs, a small bookshelf filled with treasured volumes, and a rocking chair Thomas had crafted for her as a wedding gift. A curtain separated this space from her sleeping area. Though small, it was home, and she had learned to find peace in the solitude. The kettle began to whistle on the cookstove, and Sarah prepared her nightly tea. She had just settled into her rocking chair, a worn copy of Wuthering Heights in her lap, when a sound cut through the storm's chaos. Something different from the wind and rain, something that made Rusty's ears perk up and his tail twitch. A thud. Then nothing. Sarah froze, listening. Relations with the local Apache tribe had grown increasingly tense in recent months. Settlers pushing ever westward, the cavalry responding with increasing brutality to any resistance. She kept her father's Colt revolver loaded, hanging beside the door, though she prayed never to use it. The sound came again, a weak, scraping noise, like something dragging across her porch. Setting her book aside, Sarah moved quietly to the door, taking the revolver down with practiced hands. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed her ear to the rough wood. The noise stopped. She took a deep breath, cocked the hammer of the revolver, and in one swift motion pulled the door open, raising the gun toward whatever waited in the darkness. Lightning flashed, illuminating her porch, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. A boy, no more than 12, lay crumpled on the weathered boards. His dark skin and long black hair marked him as Apache, but it was the spreading stain of crimson soaking through his deerskin shirt that drew her attention. One small hand clutched at his side, while the other reached weakly toward her door, fingers smeared with blood. For a moment, Sarah stood frozen in the doorway, the gun still raised. The political realities of her situation flashed through her mind. Helping a Native American child could be seen as treason by some. And if his people came looking for him, The boy's eyes fluttered open, dark and filled with pain. He spoke a single word in his native tongue before his head fell back against the wooden planks. Sarah Holloway made her decision. Setting the revolver aside, she stepped onto the porch, heedless of the rain now soaking her dress. Gently, she gathered the boy into her arms, surprised at how light he was. He moaned softly as she lifted him, but didn't resist. "It's all right," she whispered, though she knew he likely couldn't understand her words. "I've got you now." Carrying him inside, she kicked the door closed behind her. With careful movements, she laid him on her own bed, then rushed to gather clean linens, her medical kit, and a basin of water. As she cut away his bloodied shirt, the wound revealed itself, a bullet hole, small but ugly, just below his ribs. Not a hunting accident. The caliber was too small, the entry too clean. This was a military round, or perhaps a settler's pistol. "Who did this to you?" she murmured, knowing no answer would come. Outside, the storm continued its assault, rain pounding the roof like 1,000 angry fists. Inside, by the warm glow of lamplight, Sarah Holloway prepared to remove a bullet from the side of a child who, according to the world beyond her door, was her enemy. But as she looked down at his face, slack with pain and innocence, Sarah saw no enemy, only a child in need of mercy. With steady hands and a silent prayer, she began the delicate work of saving his life, unaware that her act of compassion would soon bring 50 Apache warriors to her doorstep at dawn. The lamplight cast long shadows across the cabin as Sarah worked. Her fingers, steady from years of tending to injuries on the frontier, probed the wound with gentle precision. The boy's breathing came in shallow gasps, his skin burning with fever. Blood seeped between her fingers as she cleaned around the entry point, revealing the angry, puckered flesh. "Hold on, child," she whispered. "Just hold on." Her medical kit, a wedding gift from her father, contained surgical instruments that had saved Thomas more than once during their early years at the homestead. A silver probe, forceps, needle and catgut thread, and a small bottle of laudanum. She'd learned to stitch wounds from her father, a doctor who had treated both Union and Confederate soldiers during the war. He taught her that pain recognized no uniform, no side. It was the great equalizer. "The body doesn't care about politics, Sarah," he told her once. "It only knows hurt and healing." The boy stirred as she pressed the probe into the wound, a whimper escaping his lips. Sarah paused, her heart twisting. She wished she could communicate with him, explain what she was doing, offer some comfort beyond her touch. "I know it hurts," she said softly. "I'm trying to help you." The probe touched metal, and Sarah exhaled slowly. The bullet hadn't fragmented, nor had it struck anything vital, a miracle given its location. With delicate movements, she worked the forceps into the wound, gripping the lead ball. The boy's body tensed, a cry breaking from his throat as she extracted the bullet with one smooth motion. Blood welled from the wound, bright red and flowing freely. Sarah pressed clean linen against it, applying steady pressure. Outside, thunder rumbled, a low counterpoint to the child's labored breathing. As she waited for the bleeding to slow, her mind drifted to the stories she'd heard in Redemption, rumors of cavalry raids on Apache camps, whispers of Native Americans attacking isolated homesteads in retaliation, a cycle of violence with no end in sight. Sarah had kept to herself, trading fairly with the occasional Native American who crossed her land. She'd left offerings, coffee, sugar, occasionally tobacco, at the edge of her property as a gesture of goodwill. Sometimes they disappeared, sometimes they remained untouched. It was a tenuous peace, maintained through distance and respect. Now, that fragile balance lay bleeding on her bed. When the wound's bleeding finally slowed, Sarah threaded her needle. The boy had fallen unconscious again. His features relaxed despite the pain. She studied his face as she worked. The high cheekbones, the straight nose, the long eyelashes resting against fever-flushed cheeks. He wore a single feather tied into his hair and a leather cord around his neck with a small carved stone. The stitches were small and neat, each one placed with care. Sarah had performed this task many times, mending Thomas after accidents, treating neighbors' injuries, even stitching her own arm once after a fall from a horse, but never had so much hung in the balance. "What's your name?" she asked softly, knowing he couldn't answer. "Who are you, little warrior?" With the wound closed and bandaged, Sarah turned her attention to the fever. She brewed a strong tea of willow bark, supporting the boy's head as she coaxed small sips past his lips. Then she bathed his face and body with cool water, working to bring down the dangerous heat that radiated from his skin. Midnight came and went. The storm gradually spent its fury, the thunder becoming distant rumbles, the rain softening to a gentle patter against the roof. Still, Sarah maintained her vigil, changing the cool cloths on the boy's forehead, checking his bandages, monitoring his pulse. In the deepest part of the night, when the world seemed suspended between yesterday and tomorrow, the boy's eyes opened. Clear and alert despite the fever, they fixed on Sarah's face with an intensity that startled her. "Tiswin," he whispered, his voice cracked and dry. Sarah hesitated, then realized he was asking for water. She'd heard the word before, from a friendly trader who sometimes passed through. She reached for the cup beside the bed, helping him drink. "Thank you," he said in halting English, surprising her further. "You speak English," Sarah said, relief washing through her. The boy nodded weakly. "Some learn from mission." "What's your name?" she asked gently. "Ahiga," he replied. "Means fighting spirit." A smile touched Sarah's lips. "It suits you, Ahiga. I'm Sarah." "Why, help?" His eyes never left her face, searching for understanding. Sarah considered the question, its simplicity belying its depth. She thought of Thomas, of her father, of all she'd lost and gained on this frontier. "Because you needed it," she answered finally. "Because it was right." Ahiga seemed to accept this, his eyelids growing heavy again. Before sleep reclaimed him, he spoke once more, his voice barely audible. "My father, Black Wolf, will come." The words settled in Sarah's stomach like lead. Black Wolf. Even isolated as she was, she'd heard stories about the Apache war chief, his strategic brilliance, his fierce protection of his people, his uncompromising resistance to the encroachment of white settlers. If this boy was his son. Sarah moved to the window, drawing aside the curtain. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silver-washed landscape. The moon, nearly full, illuminated the clearing around her cabin, the forest beyond, the distant mountains. Somewhere out there, an Apache warrior was missing his son. Somewhere out there, decisions were being made that would arrive with the dawn. She returned to the bedside, checking Ahiga's fever again. It had begun to break, his skin no longer burning to the touch. The worst had passed, at least for now. Sarah sank into the chair beside the bed, suddenly aware of her exhaustion. Rusty jumped onto her lap, purring contentedly, oblivious to the weight of the moment. She stroked his fur absently, her eyes never leaving the sleeping boy. "What have I done, Rusty?" she whispered. The answer came not from the cat, but from deep within her own heart. She had done what she couldn't walk away from, what her conscience demanded. Now all that remained was to face the consequences when they arrived with the morning light. Sarah woke with a start, neck stiff from sleeping upright in the chair. Pale morning light filtered through the window, casting long shadows across the cabin floor. For a moment, disorientation clouded her mind. Why wasn't she in her bed? Then her gaze fell on Ahiga, and the events of the previous night crashed back into her consciousness. The boy slept peacefully, his breathing deep and even. The fever had broken sometime during the night, leaving his skin cool to the touch. Sarah checked his bandages. No fresh bleeding, no signs of infection. A good sign, but they weren't out of danger yet, not by any measure. "My father will come." The words echoed in her mind as she moved silently around the cabin, stoking the fire and putting coffee on to boil. Sarah had no illusions about what that might mean. The settlers in Redemption spoke of Apache justice in hushed, fearful tones. Stories of ranchers found with their throats cut, of isolated cabins burned to the ground, their inhabitants missing or worse. Whether these tales were truth or exaggeration born of prejudice, she couldn't say. But she understood enough about the harsh realities of frontier justice to know that finding his son, wounded by a white man's bullet, would not incline Black Wolf toward mercy. Yet what choice had she had? Leave the child to die on her porch? That option had never truly existed for her. As the coffee percolated, filling the cabin with its rich aroma, Sarah moved to the window. The storm had washed the world clean, leaving behind a landscape glistening with morning dew. Her small garden, the barn where she kept 2 horses and a milk cow, the chicken coop, the beginnings of the wheat field Thomas had dreamed of, all appeared peaceful in the soft light of dawn. No sign of riders, not yet. Sarah turned back to her domestic tasks, finding comfort in their familiarity. She mixed cornmeal batter for Johnny cakes, sliced salt pork to fry, gathered eggs from yesterday's collecting. Normal morning activities that belied the knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. "Sarah." The weak voice startled her. Ahiga had awakened, his dark eyes following her movements around the cabin. "Good morning," she said, approaching the bed with a cup of water. "True, how do you feel?" "Hurts," he admitted, accepting the cup with shaking hands, "but better." "That's good. The bullet's out and the fever's down. You need to rest, though." Ahiga nodded, then winced at the movement. His gaze drifted to the window, a shadow crossing his face. "How long?" Sarah understood the question. "Since I found you. About 8 hours. It's just after sunrise now." The boy's expression tightened. "They will come soon. Your father, Black Wolf." Ahiga nodded again, more carefully this time. "Yes, and others." "How many others?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the fluttering of her heart. "Many," was all he said, and the simplicity of the answer chilled her more than any specific number could have. Sarah moved back to the stove, turning the salt pork in the pan. The sizzle and pop of the fat seemed absurdly mundane against the weight of their conversation. She flipped the Johnny cakes, golden brown on each side, and slid them onto a plate. "Can you eat something?" she asked, returning to Ahiga's side. "You need strength." The boy eyed the food cautiously, then nodded. Sarah helped him sit up, propping pillows behind him, careful of his wound. She cut the Johnny cake into small pieces, watching as he took tentative bites. "Why were you out in the storm?" she asked gently. "How did you get shot?" Ahiga chewed slowly, considering his words. "Hunting, with 2 others, older boys." He paused, swallowing with effort. "White men came, soldiers, maybe, started shooting." His eyes darkened with remembered fear. "I ran, got hit. Others?" "I don't know." Sarah felt a cold anger rising within her, shooting at children, whether they wore uniforms or not. What kind of men fired upon boys hunting? "How far is your camp?" she asked. "Half-day's ride." Ahiga pointed northeast. "In mountains." So close. Sarah had never known they lived so near, though she'd suspected the Apache weren't far. She'd respected the invisible boundaries, never venturing too deep into the foothills. "What will happen?" she asked carefully. "When they come." Ahiga looked at her directly, his young face solemn beyond his years. "Depends on you." The simplicity of his answer hung in the air between them. Sarah nodded, understanding. Her actions, her words, her manner when they arrived, everything would be judged. Everything would matter. After Ahiga had eaten what he could, Sarah helped him drink a willow bark tea for the pain. Then she went about tidying the cabin, washing the bloody linens, putting away her medical supplies. All the while, she felt the minutes ticking away, each one bringing the inevitable confrontation closer. When she had done all she could inside, Sarah stepped out onto the porch. The morning air was crisp and clean after the storm, the sky a deep, impossible blue. She drew it into her lungs, savoring its sweetness. Whatever happened next, she wanted to remember this moment, the beauty of the land that had become her home, the satisfaction of having done what was right, regardless of consequence. She had just turned to go back inside when she saw it, a flash of movement at the edge of the tree line, nearly a quarter-mile away. Then another, and another. Riders, moving with purpose, moving toward her cabin. Sarah stood frozen, watching as they emerged from the forest like shadows taking form. Warriors on horseback, their bodies adorned with paint and feathers, weapons clearly visible even at this distance. They spread out as they approached, forming a wide arc that would encircle her property. She counted quickly, 10, 20, 30, then gave up. There were too many, 50, perhaps more. An overwhelming force that made her one shotgun and revolver seem pathetic in comparison. Heart pounding, Sarah stepped back into the cabin, closing the door behind her. Ahiga had fallen asleep again, his face peaceful in repose, unaware that his prophecy was being fulfilled. Sarah moved to her husband's trunk, unlocking it with hands that refused to tremble. Inside lay his formal clothes, letters from their courtship, a daguerreotype of their wedding day. Beneath these treasures was a small leather pouch. She opened it, removing a silver medallion on a chain, a gift from a Shoshone woman whose husband Thomas had helped years ago. The woman had pressed it into Sarah's hands, explaining in broken English that it symbolized peaceful intentions, that it had protected her people for generations. Sarah had never worn it, uncertain if doing so would be disrespectful. Now she placed it around her neck, feeling its weight against her skin. She had no illusions that it held any real power, but it felt right to acknowledge her respect for native traditions in this moment. Next, she took Thomas's shotgun from above the fireplace, checking that it was loaded. The revolver went into the pocket of her apron. Not that she intended to use either weapon. Against so many, it would be suicide, but having them close gave her a measure of comfort. Finally, she moved to Ahiga's side, gently waking him. "They're here," she said softly. The boy's eyes flew open, instantly alert. "How many?" "Too many to count," she answered honestly. "What should I do?" Ahiga struggled to sit up. "Help me stand." "I must go out with you." "You're too weak," Sarah protested. "Must," he insisted, "or they will think you hold me prisoner." Understanding dawned in her eyes. She nodded, helping him rise from the bed. His legs buckled momentarily, but he steadied himself against her. Sarah wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, supporting him as they moved slowly toward the door. Outside, the thunder of hooves had grown louder, then stopped. She knew without looking that they had surrounded the cabin, that 50 pairs of eyes now watched her door, waiting. "Ready?" she asked softly. Ahiga nodded, his small hand finding hers. "I will tell them you saved me." Sarah squeezed his fingers gently, then reached for the door handle. Whatever waited on the other side, judgment, mercy, or something between, she would face it standing tall, with the boy she had saved at her side. With one deep breath, she opened the door to meet her fate. The world seemed to hold its breath as Sarah stepped onto her porch, Ahiga leaning heavily against her side. Morning sunlight spilled across the clearing, illuminating the scene before her with merciless clarity. They had indeed surrounded the cabin, Apache warriors on horseback, their faces painted with ochre and black lines that accentuated expressions hardened by years of conflict. Some wore traditional buckskin, others had incorporated elements of cavalry uniforms, grim trophies from previous encounters. Feathers adorned their hair, and around their necks hung various talismans and medallions. Their weapons, rifles, bows, lances decorated with eagle feathers, remained ready but not aimed directly at her. Not yet. They sat motionless on their mounts, a circle of silent judgment closing her in. From their midst, one rider moved forward. Even without Ahiga's whispered "Father," Sarah would have known this was Black Wolf. Authority radiated from him like heat from a flame. Taller than the others, with broad shoulders and a face lined by both years and hardship, he carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a leader. His long black hair, streaked with silver at the temples, was adorned with 2 eagle feathers. Around his neck hung a medicine pouch decorated with intricate beadwork. Unlike many of the others, his face bore no paint, allowing Sarah to see clearly the sharp intelligence in his dark eyes as they fixed upon his son. Black Wolf dismounted in one fluid motion, his moccasined feet landing silently on the damp earth. The horse, a magnificent pinto stallion, remained perfectly still without being tethered. The war chief approached slowly, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. Sarah felt Ahiga straighten beside her, summoning strength he didn't have. The boy spoke rapidly in Apache, his voice surprisingly strong despite his weakened state. Though she couldn't understand the words, Sarah recognized the cadence of a story being told. Ahiga was explaining what had happened. Black Wolf's expression remained impassive as he listened, his eyes flicking between his son and Sarah. When Ahiga finished speaking, a heavy silence fell over the clearing. Then, deliberately, Black Wolf approached the porch steps. Sarah fought the instinct to retreat, keeping her spine straight and her gaze steady. She was acutely aware of the shotgun just inside the door, of the revolver in her apron pocket, both utterly useless against such numbers. "My son says you removed the white man's bullet from his body," Black Wolf said in clear, accented English, "that you fought death for him through the night." The sound of his voice, deep and measured, startled Sarah almost as much as his command of English. She nodded, finding her voice. "Yes, he needed help." Black Wolf studied her face with unnerving intensity. "Many white women would have left him to die, or killed him themselves." "I'm not many women," Sarah replied simply. Something flickered in Black Wolf's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or grudging respect. He moved closer, now standing directly before her at the bottom of the steps. From this distance, Sarah could see the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, the weathered lines around his eyes, the subtle gray at his temples. "Who shot my son?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. "I don't know," Sarah answered honestly. "Ahiga said they might have been soldiers." Black Wolf's jaw tightened. "The blue coats hunt our children now." Sarah felt a surge of anger on Ahiga's behalf. It was wrong. Inexcusable, no matter who did it. Her boldness drew murmurs from the watching warriors. Black Wolf's eyebrows rose slightly, but he made no comment on her statement. Instead, he turned to Ahiga, speaking again in Apache. The boy responded, his voice weaker now, the effort of standing beginning to take its toll. Black Wolf's expression softened almost imperceptibly as he looked at his son, reaching out to touch the boy's face briefly. Then he turned back to Sarah. "He cannot ride yet." It wasn't a question, but Sarah answered anyway. "No, the wound needs time to heal. Moving him now could start the bleeding again." Black Wolf nodded once. Decision made. "Then we will make camp here." Sarah blinked, momentarily stunned. Whatever she had expected, threats, demands, even violence, it wasn't this matter-of-fact announcement. "Here," she repeated, "on my land." "Unless you prefer we take him and go," Black Wolf replied, a subtle challenge in his tone. Sarah looked at Ahiga, who was now trembling with exhaustion, his face pale beneath his natural copper tone. The answer was obvious. "No," she said firmly. "He stays until he's stronger." She took a breath, then added, "And you're welcome to camp here. There's a stream beyond those trees with good water." Black Wolf studied her for a long moment, as if reassessing her. Then he turned and barked orders to his men in Apache. Immediately, the circle broke. Warriors dismounting and beginning to unpack supplies from their horses. "4 will guard the cabin," Black Wolf informed her. "The rest will make camp by the stream." Sarah nodded her understanding, feeling some of the tension leave her body. They weren't leaving, but neither were they attacking. For now, an uneasy truce existed. "I need to get Ahiga back to bed," she said. "He's exhausted." Black Wolf gestured his permission, and Sarah carefully guided the boy back inside. As she helped him to the bed, she was aware of Black Wolf following them into the cabin, his presence filling the small space. She could feel his eyes taking in every detail, the modest furnishings, the books on the shelf, the medical supplies still laid out from the night before. Once Ahiga was settled, Black Wolf spoke to him again in Apache, his voice gentler than before. The boy replied weakly, his eyelids already drooping with fatigue. "He needs rest," Sarah said quietly. "And water, the fever might return." Black Wolf nodded. "You have medicine knowledge." "Some," she acknowledged. "My father was a doctor. I learned from him." "And your husband?" Black Wolf asked, glancing at the man's coat that hung by the door, the boots beside it. "Dead. 3 years now." Sarah's voice remained steady, though the familiar ache returned to her chest. "Pneumonia," a flash of something, recognition perhaps, crossed Black Wolf's face. "The coughing sickness took my wife also. 5 winters passed." The unexpected sharing of personal loss created a moment of strange connection between them. Sarah nodded, not knowing what to say, yet understanding completely the weight he carried. The moment passed quickly. Black Wolf straightened, his expression becoming impassive once more. "My men will bring food. You will continue to care for my son." Again, not a question, but Sarah answered, "Of course." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. Without looking back, he said, "If he had died, I would have burned this cabin with you inside it." The blunt statement sent a chill down Sarah's spine, not because it surprised her, but because she knew it was absolutely true. "I know," she replied simply. Black Wolf glanced over his shoulder, meeting her eyes. Something passed between them, an acknowledgement, perhaps, of mutual understanding. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him. Sarah sank into the chair beside the bed, her legs suddenly weak. Rusty emerged from his hiding place under the bed, jumping into her lap as if nothing unusual had happened. She stroked his fur absently, watching Ahiga's peaceful sleep. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the Apache camp being established, horses being unsaddled, teepees being raised, voices calling to one another. What had been her quiet, isolated homestead was now the temporary home of 50 Apache warriors. And their leader, a man who would have killed her without hesitation had circumstances been different, was now bound to her by the life of his son. Sarah wasn't naive enough to mistake this arrangement for friendship, but neither could she deny the strange sense that something significant had shifted in her world. As if reading her thoughts, Ahiga stirred slightly. "Not enemy now," he murmured, his eyes still closed. Sarah looked down at the boy, wondering if he spoke from dreams or understanding. Either way, she hoped he was right. Because for better or worse, their fates were now intertwined in ways none of them could have anticipated when the storm began last night. And somewhere beyond her cabin walls, Black Wolf was likely thinking the same thing. Midday sun beat down on Sarah's homestead, transforming the dew-kissed morning into a sweltering afternoon. The Apache camp bustled with activity. Women who had arrived shortly after the warriors were erecting teepees, building cooking fires, and hanging drying racks for meat. Children darted between the structures, their laughter carrying across the clearing to Sarah's cabin. She watched from her window as she prepared a broth for Ahiga, who slept fitfully on her bed. The scene before her seemed surreal, as if two worlds had collided and now awkwardly occupied the same space, neither quite sure of the other's boundaries. 4 warriors remained posted around her cabin as Black Wolf had ordered. They sat motionless, rifles across their laps, eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Not guards to keep her in, Sarah realized, but sentinels to protect what was now, however temporarily, an extension of their camp, the place where the chief's son recovered. A knock at the door startled her. Setting the broth aside, Sarah approached cautiously. When she opened it, she found a young Apache woman standing on the porch, a basket in her hands. The woman's eyes widened slightly at the sight of Sarah, but she held out the basket without speaking. Inside were fresh berries, strips of dried venison, and corn cakes wrapped in leaves. A peace offering, or perhaps payment for Ahiga's care. Sarah accepted it with a nod of thanks. The woman hesitated, then peered past Sarah toward where Ahiga lay sleeping. "He's resting," Sarah said, stepping aside slightly so the woman could see the boy. "The fever hasn't returned." Though she likely didn't understand the words, the woman seemed to comprehend their meaning. She nodded, relief visible in her eyes, then spoke a single word that Sarah recognized from Ahiga's speech, "Nijoni." "Thank you." Before Sarah could respond, the woman turned and hurried back toward the camp. Sarah watched her go, feeling a strange sense of connection despite the vast gulf of language and culture between them. When she closed the door and turned back to her tasks, she found Ahiga awake, observing her with those solemn dark eyes. "My aunt," he explained weakly. "She helped raise me after Mother died." Sarah brought him water, helping him sit up slightly to drink. "She brought food. She seems kind." Ahiga nodded. "She worries." He glanced toward the window, where the sounds of the camp filtered in. "All worry." "Father Most, your father?" Sarah hesitated, unsure how to phrase her question. "He speaks English very well. Mission school. Young. Before fighting." Ahiga winced as he shifted position. "Learned white man ways, then learned to fight white men." Sarah absorbed this information as she checked his bandages. The wound looked clean, no signs of infection. His skin remained cool to the touch, a good sign. "The broth is almost ready," she told him. "You need to eat to regain your strength." "Father will want to speak with you," Ahiga said suddenly. "Tonight?" Around fire. Sarah's hands stilled. About what? The boy's expression turned grave. Many things, bad things coming. Before she could ask what he meant, another knock came at the door, more forceful than the last. Sarah smoothed her apron and went to answer it. Black Wolf himself stood on her porch, somehow managing to appear both relaxed and intensely alert simultaneously. He'd removed his more ceremonial adornments, now dressed simply in buckskin leggings and a fringed shirt. The knife remained at his belt, and a rifle was slung across his back. "I would see my son," he stated without preamble. Sarah stepped aside. Of course. Black Wolf entered, his presence seeming to shrink the cabin's dimensions. He moved directly to Ahiga's bedside, speaking softly in Apache. The boy responded, his voice stronger than before. Sarah busied herself with the broth, giving them privacy while remaining close enough to intervene if Ahiga became overtaxed. After several minutes of conversation, Black Wolf turned to her. "The wound heals clean." "Yes," Sarah answered. "If infection doesn't set in, and if he rests properly, he should recover fully." Black Wolf nodded once. "Good." He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You have livestock?" The statement caught Sarah off guard. "Yes, 2 horses, a milk cow, chickens. My people will tend them," he declared. "While you care for Ahiga." Sarah blinked in surprise. "That's kind. Thank you." "Not kindness." Balance. His gaze was direct, challenging. "You save my son. We do not leave debts unpaid." The concept resonated with Sarah's own sense of justice. She nodded her understanding. "Tonight," Black Wolf continued, "you will join our council fire." Though phrased as an invitation, Sarah recognized it as a command. Ahiga mentioned that, he said, "There are bad things coming." Something flashed in Black Wolf's eyes, approval perhaps that his son had shared this, or surprise that she mentioned it so directly. "Yes," he confirmed, "things you should know, now that our paths cross." With that cryptic statement, he turned back to Ahiga, placing a hand gently on the boy's head in what was clearly a gesture of blessing. Then, without another word to Sarah, he departed as suddenly as he had arrived. Sarah released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She brought the broth to Ahiga, who accepted it with trembling hands. "What bad things, Ahiga?" she asked softly. "What should I prepare for?" The boy sipped the broth before answering. "Soldiers, more coming, looking for us." His eyes met hers, old beyond their years. "But did for you now too, maybe?" A chill ran through Sarah despite the cabin's warmth. If Ahiga had been shot by soldiers, and if Black Wolf's people had retaliated in any way, the cavalry would indeed come looking. And finding 50 Apache warriors camped on a white woman's homestead would lead to only one conclusion in their minds. "I see," she said quietly. Though in truth, she was only beginning to understand the complex web she had become entangled in. Outside, the Apache camp continued its activities. Women called to children, men dressed game from a morning hunt, smoke rose from cooking fires. Temporary, ordinary life, continuing under the shadow of approaching conflict. Inside, Sarah Holloway realized that by saving one child's life, she had potentially placed herself at the center of a storm that had been brewing long before she found Ahiga on her porch. And tonight, around the council fire, she would learn exactly what that meant for her future, if she still had one. Dusk settled over the homestead like a purple veil, bringing with it a blessed respite from the day's heat. Torches and campfires flickered to life throughout the Apache encampment, creating pools of golden light against the gathering darkness. The scent of cooking meat and wood smoke hung in the air, mingling with the earthy perfume of sage and pine from the surrounding forest. Sarah stood on her porch, watching as activity in the camp shifted from day's work to evening's reflection. Ahiga had fallen asleep again after eating, his body focused on the demanding task of healing. She'd left a lamp burning low beside him and the door slightly ajar so she could hear if he called out. One of the warriors who had been stationed at her cabin all day approached, unlike the others who had maintained stoic silence. This one nodded respectfully. "Chief says come," he said in halting English, gesturing toward the largest fire at the center of the camp. Sarah touched the silver medallion at her throat, drawing comfort from its cool weight. She had changed into her best remaining dress, a simple blue cotton garment with white piping along the collar. Her hair was freshly braided and pinned up, her face washed clean. If she was to face judgment, she would do so with dignity. "I'm ready," she replied, stepping off the porch. The warrior led her through the camp, past cooking fires where women prepared evening meals, past children who paused in their play to stare openly at her, past teepees where elderly men and women sat weaving or carving. Some faces registered hostility at her presence. Others showed only curiosity. Most, however, remained carefully neutral, revealing nothing of their thoughts as the white woman walked among them. They arrived at a large clearing where a substantial fire burned. Around it sat about 20 men, the senior warriors and elders of the tribe, Sarah presumed. Black Wolf occupied a prominent position, seated on a buffalo robe with his back to a large boulder. He watched impassively as Sarah was led to the fire. To her surprise, 2 women also sat in the circle, one elderly with a deeply lined face and sharp eyes, and one middle-aged, whom Sarah recognized as Ahiga's aunt. Their inclusion suggested this was not merely a war council, but something more comprehensive. "Sit," Black Wolf instructed, indicating a spot directly across the fire from him. Sarah complied, lowering herself onto the ground with as much grace as she could muster. The flames between them cast flickering shadows across Black Wolf's features, emphasizing the sharp angles of his face and the intensity of his gaze. For several long moments, no one spoke. The crackling of the fire and the distant calls of nightbirds were the only sounds. Sarah forced herself to breathe evenly, to meet the stares of those around her without flinching. Finally, Black Wolf raised his hand, and a hush fell over the already quiet gathering. "The woman who calls herself Sarah Holloway has saved my son's life," he began, his deep voice carrying easily in the night air. "For this, she has earned the right to speak in our council." A murmur ran through the circle, approval from some, skepticism from others. The old woman's eyes narrowed as she studied Sarah with unnerving intensity. "Before she speaks," Black Wolf continued, "she must understand why we are here and what comes on the wind toward all of us." He gestured to a warrior seated to his right, a man perhaps a few years younger than himself, with a face marred by a recent scar across the cheek. "Nita," Black Wolf said, "tell what you saw at the fort." The warrior named Nita nodded gravely. 3 days ago, I watched the Blue Coat fort from the hills. Many soldiers arrived, more guns, more horses." He held up his fingers. 2, maybe 300. They bring big guns that boom." "Artillery," Sarah murmured, a chill running through her despite the fire's warmth. Nita nodded. "Their leader is a new man, tall, with yellow hair and dead eyes. The other soldiers fear him." "Colonel James Hargrove," Black Wolf said, watching Sarah's reaction closely. "You know this name?" Sarah shook her head. "No, I've been isolated by choice." She hesitated, then asked, "What does it mean? These new soldiers, this colonel?" Black Wolf's expression darkened. It means they are done with treaties and talking. It means they come to finish what they started when they shot my son. Another warrior spoke up, his face painted with a single red stripe across the eyes. They plan to drive us from these mountains, to put us on the reservation far to the south, or to kill us if we refuse. We have watched them, added an elderly man with braided white hair. They talk to miners, to ranchers. They make maps of our hunting grounds, of our water sources. They prepare for war. Sarah looked around the circle, taking in the grave faces illuminated by firelight, and Ahiga is shooting. It was deliberate. A message, Black Wolf said flatly. They kill our children to tell us our future is dying. They did not know they shot the son of Black Wolf. The implications settled heavily on Sarah's shoulders. This wasn't a random act of violence or a tragic misunderstanding. It was the opening move in a calculated campaign to eliminate the Apache from their ancestral lands. "Ma, why tell me this?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Black Wolf leaned forward, the firelight casting his face in sharp relief. "Because you are now part of this story, willing or not. The soldiers will come here. Following our trail, they will find you with us. And they will assume I'm your hostage," Sarah finished for him, the reality of her situation becoming clearer. Or worse, that I'm your ally. Yes? Black Wolf's gaze was unflinching. "So you must choose Sarah Holloway. When they come, what will you say? What will you do?" The question hung in the air, weighted with consequence. Sarah felt the eyes of the entire council upon her, judging, evaluating, waiting. Her answer would determine not only her own fate, but potentially that of everyone present. She took a deep breath, organizing her thoughts. "I will tell the truth, that Ahiga came to me wounded, that I helped him as any decent person would, that you arrived looking for your son." She met Black Wolf's gaze directly. "I won't lie about what happened. And if they do not believe this truth..." The old woman spoke for the first time, her voice surprisingly strong. "If they call you traitor, if they threaten you..." Sarah's chin lifted slightly. "Then that is my burden to bear. I won't condemn your people to save myself." A murmur ran through the circle, surprise, perhaps, or skepticism that she would hold to such words when facing armed soldiers. "Bold words," Black Wolf said quietly. "Many whites speak of honor until fear touches them." "My husband and I came west to build something true," Sarah replied, an edge entering her voice. "Not to participate in slaughter. I've buried the person I loved most in this world. I'm not afraid to stand by what's right, whatever the cost." The fire popped and hissed in the silence that followed her declaration. Black Wolf studied her with that penetrating gaze, as if trying to see beyond her words to the truth of her character. Finally, he nodded once. "I believe you." Relief washed through Sarah, though she maintained her composure. But it does not matter what I believe," Black Wolf continued. "The soldiers will come within 2 days, perhaps 3. They will make their own judgment." He looked around the circle. "We must decide now. Do we move deeper into the mountains with my son still wounded, or do we stay and face what comes?" The council erupted into debate, some arguing in Apache, others responding in kind. Sarah couldn't follow the words, but she understood the core of the disagreement. Flee or fight, risk Ahiga's life or risk everyone's. As the debate intensified, a young warrior suddenly appeared at the edge of the circle, speaking rapidly in Apache. The council fell silent, all eyes turning to Black Wolf. "What is it?" Sarah asked, sensing the shift in mood. Black Wolf's face had hardened into a mask of controlled rage. "Scouts have found Key and Tarek," Sarah recalled Ahiga's words. Hunting, with 2 others, older boys. The boys who were with Ahiga, she asked softly. Black Wolf nodded once. She dead, their bodies left on display near the trading post as warning. His eyes reflected the firelight like obsidian. Their throats were cut after they were shot. They were scalped. Gasps and murmurs of outrage rippled through the circle. Sarah felt sick, imagining boys not much older than Ahiga subjected to such brutality. By soldiers, she asked, though she already feared the answer. By men who wore blue coats but hid their faces, Black Wolf replied grimly. Men who wished us to know what awaits us if we resist. The council descended into grim silence. Sarah looked around at the faces illuminated by firelight, men and women whose lives had been defined by loss and resistance, whose children now faced extermination at the hands of those who claimed to represent civilization. I'm sorry, she said. The words wholly inadequate, but all she had to offer. What they did, it's monstrous. The old woman's eyes snapped to Sarah's face. Yet, you would have us trust that you are different. That your words of honor mean anything against the actions of your people. Sarah met her gaze steadily. I can't undo what others have done. I can only stand by my own actions. I saved Ahiga. I opened my home to you. I'm willing to face the consequences of those choices. The old woman held her gaze for a long moment, then surprisingly inclined her head slightly, a small acknowledgement, if not acceptance. Black Wolf rose to his feet, commanding immediate attention. We have no choice now. We cannot move Ahiga safely, and we cannot leave him. His eyes swept the circle. We will stay. We will prepare. When the soldiers come, we will show them that Apache children are not the only ones who can bleed. The council rumbled with approval, warriors gripping their weapons with renewed purpose. And the woman? Nita asked, nodding toward Sarah. Black Wolf looked at her across the flames, his expression unreadable. She has made her choice. She stands with us. Sarah felt the weight of those words settle upon her. Not a burden exactly, but a mantle of responsibility she hadn't sought yet, couldn't refuse. By saving one child, she had aligned herself with his people in a conflict that had been brewing for generations. As the council dispersed to prepare for what lay ahead, Black Wolf approached her, his presence as commanding up close as it had been across the fire. You should know, he said quietly, so only she could hear, that when the soldiers come, there will be blood. No matter what you say, no matter what I do, some wounds run too deep for words to heal. Sarah nodded, understanding the warning for what it was. I know. But we still have to try. Something flickered in Black Wolf's eyes, respect, perhaps, or simply acknowledgement of her resolve. Your husband, he said unexpectedly. He was a fortunate man. Before she could respond to the surprising statement, he turned and walked away, leaving Sarah alone by the dying council fire, the stars wheeling overhead in a sky indifferent to the human dramas unfolding beneath it. Tomorrow would bring preparations for a confrontation she had never sought. The day after might bring death to her doorstep. But tonight, Sarah Holloway knew with absolute clarity that she had found her place in a story larger than herself, and she would see it through to whatever end awaited them all. Dawn broke over Sarah's homestead with a golden stillness that belied the furious activity soon to follow. She had slept little after the council, her mind racing with all she had learned, all that might come. When she finally rose and stepped onto her porch, she found the Apache camp already in motion, a coordinated dance of purpose and preparation. Warriors gathered weapons and made repairs to bows, arrows, and rifles. Women packed essential supplies into parfleches, rawhide containers that could be quickly loaded onto horses if retreat became necessary. Children were being instructed by elders, their usual play replaced by solemn attention to tasks that might soon mean survival. Sarah checked on Ahiga, finding him awake and notably stronger. His eyes were clear, his skin cool to the touch. The fever had not returned. "You should eat," she told him, helping him sit up against the pillows. "You'll need your strength." Ahiga nodded, studying her face. "You spoke with father." "At the council?" "Yes," Sarah confirmed, bringing him a bowl of cornmeal mush sweetened with honey. "He told me about the soldiers, about your friends." She hesitated. "I'm so sorry." "Ahiga." The boy's expression darkened, grief and anger warring in his young features. "He was my cousin, Tarek my friend since we could walk." His voice remained steady, but his hands trembled slightly as he accepted the bowl. "And they died because blue coats want us gone, all of us." "That won't happen," Sarah said firmly, though she had no right to make such promises. Ahiga looked at her with eyes too old for his face. "You don't know the hate they have. My father does. That's why he fights." Before Sarah could respond, a shadow fell across the doorway. Black Wolf stood there, watching their exchange. How long he had been listening, she couldn't say, but his expression suggested he had heard enough. "Your fever is gone," he said to Ahiga, approaching the bed. He placed a hand on his son's forehead, a gesture so tender it momentarily transformed his stern features. "Yes, father," Ahiga replied. "The pain is less too." Black Wolf nodded, satisfied. "Good. You must be strong now, strong enough to ride if necessary." Sarah frowned. "He shouldn't be moved yet. The wound may not matter if bullets start flying," Black Wolf interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. He turned to Sarah. "We must speak outside." She followed him onto the porch, closing the door behind her to give Ahiga some peace. The morning air was cool, but the sun promised another hot day ahead. "The scouts report dust to the east," Black Wolf said without preamble. "Riders, many, still far, but moving this way." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "The soldiers? Already? Perhaps? Or settlers? Or both?" His face remained impassive, but Sarah detected tension in the set of his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes. "Or do we prepare either way?" Sarah nodded, then took a breath. "What can I do to help, I mean?" Black Wolf studied her, perhaps searching for insincerity in her offer. Finding none, he replied, "Your medical supplies. Can you show our healer what you have? How to use it?" "Of course." It was a small thing, but a meaningful gesture of trust, sharing her knowledge, her resources. "And you should prepare too," he added. "Pack what matters most, what you cannot leave behind." The implication was clear. She might need to flee, might lose everything else. Sarah glanced back at her cabin, thinking of all it contained. Most were just things, replaceable, ultimately meaningless, but some items, Thomas's letters, her father's medical books, her mother's wedding ring, those held pieces of her soul. "I understand," she said quietly. Black Wolf seemed about to say more when one of his warriors approached, speaking rapidly in Apache. His expression hardened as he listened. "What is it?" Sarah asked, when the warrior had finished. Riders approached from the west. 4 men, not soldiers. Sarah frowned. "From Redemption. That's the closest town." "Perhaps," Black Wolf said grimly. "Or hunters, trappers. Men who would see an Apache camp and ride for the fort." The gravity of their situation struck Sarah anew. Any white men who discovered them might bring the cavalry down upon them even sooner, yet they could hardly hide 50 warriors and their families. "Let me speak to them," she suggested. "If they're from Redemption, I might know them. I can explain." "Explain what?" Black Wolf's voice was sharp. "That you harbor savages. That you betrayed your race." The bitter words hung between them. Sarah met his gaze unflinchingly. "That I saved a child. That your people are under my protection on my land. That they should ride on and mind their business." Something flickered in Black Wolf's eyes, surprise, perhaps, at her fierceness. "And if they do not listen?" Sarah's hand strayed to her apron pocket, where the revolver still rested. "Then we'll know their intentions, won't we?" After a moment's consideration, Black Wolf nodded. "You will speak to them. My warriors will be hidden, watching. If these men threaten you, they will not leave this valley alive." It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was better than an immediate bloodbath. Sarah nodded her agreement. "I should change," she said, looking down at her rumpled dress. "And check on Ahiga once more." Black Wolf glanced toward the cabin, something softer crossing his features. "He is strong, like his mother was." The unexpected personal reference caught Sarah off guard. What was she like? His mother? For a moment, she thought Black Wolf would not answer, would retreat behind the wall of stoic leadership he maintained. But after a pause, he replied, "Wailoni was like the mountain stream. Quiet sometimes, fierce others, always finding her way forward." A shadow passed over his face. The coughing sickness took her too quickly. Ahiga was 7. "I'm sorry," Sarah said softly. "It's a terrible illness. My husband—" She trailed off, the parallel between their losses hanging in the air. Black Wolf nodded once, acknowledgement rather than sympathy. Then, as if catching himself in a moment of vulnerability, he straightened. "Prepare for the riders. I will position my men." He strode away, calling orders to his warriors. Within minutes, the visible activity in the camp had ceased. Women and children retreating into teepees, warriors melting into the trees and brush. To casual observers, the camp might appear to hold only a handful of people going about peaceful business. Sarah returned to the cabin, quickly explaining to Ahiga what was happening. The boy's expression grew worried. "Be careful," he said. "Some white men hate more than others." "I know," she assured him, selecting a clean, respectable dress from her trunk, one she might wear to town meetings or Sunday services. "But this is my land. They'll have to respect that at least." As she pinned her hair neatly at the nape of her neck, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in the small mirror above her washstand. The woman who stared back at her looked the same as always, perhaps a bit more tired, a touch more weathered, but behind her eyes was something new, a certainty that hadn't been there before. In less than 2 days, her world had expanded beyond the boundaries of her homestead. She had pledged herself to a cause that wasn't hers by birth or obligation, but by choice. The simple, profound choice to value life over prejudice, humanity over division. She tucked her revolver into the pocket of her dress, where it would remain hidden but accessible. Then she stepped outside to wait for the approaching riders, a solitary figure standing before her cabin, while 50 Apache warriors watched silently from concealment, ready to defend her as one of their own. The minutes stretched like hours as a cloud of dust gradually resolved into 4 men on horseback, moving at a steady pace toward her property. As they drew closer, Sarah recognized 2 of them, Frank Miller, who owned the general store in Redemption, and Caleb Dawson, a cattle rancher whose property lay to the northeast. The other 2 were strangers to her, rough-looking men with the hard eyes of those who made their living on the violent edges of the frontier. They reined in their horses about 20 yards from her porch, studying the seemingly quiet homestead with obvious suspicion. Sarah maintained her position, hands folded calmly before her, posture straight and dignified. "Mrs. Holloway," Miller called, removing his hat. "Good day to you, ma'am." "Mr. Miller," she replied with a polite nod. "Mr. Dawson, what brings you gentlemen out this way?" The men exchanged glances, a silent communication that raised Sarah's guard. "We're looking for signs of Apache," Dawson said bluntly. "War party moved through these parts yesterday, tracked them most of the way here before the trail got messy in that storm." "Apache?" Sarah kept her expression neutral, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "I haven't seen any. Just been tending my garden and livestock, same as always." One of the strangers, a man with a pockmarked face and a cavalry carbine strapped to his saddle, spat tobacco juice onto the ground. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but we know better. Their sign is all over this valley, fresh too. And we saw smoke from multiple fires last night," added the fourth man, whose eyes never stopped scanning the tree line. "Too many for just one woman living alone." Sarah maintained her composure, though she felt the situation slipping away from her. "I've had a few cooking fires going, preserving the last of my winter stores before the heat sets in properly." Miller dismounted, approaching the porch with a concerned expression. "Mrs. Holloway, if you're in some kind of trouble, if they've threatened you, you can tell us. We've got enough men back in town to help." The genuine concern in his voice almost broke Sarah's resolve. These weren't evil men, just frightened ones, convinced of dangers that were partly real, partly imagined, all filtered through years of mutual hostility and misunderstanding. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Miller, truly," she said carefully. "But I assure you I'm in no danger, and I'd prefer if you gentlemen continued on your way. I value my privacy, as you know." The pockmarked man snorted derisively. "Privacy," she says. "Woman alone out here for 3 years. Suddenly she's got reasons for privacy." He turned to his companions. "I say we search the property. Apaches could have her under duress, making her say this." Sarah's hand slipped into her pocket, fingers closing around the revolver. "This is my land, sir. You have no right to search anything." "Ma'am," Dawson said, his voice hardening, "there's a war brewing. Colonel Hargrove's got orders to clear these mountains of hostiles. If you're harboring them, willingly or not, you're putting yourself in harm's way." "The only hostile action on my property today," Sarah replied evenly, "would be you gentlemen trespassing against my wishes. Now, I've been polite, but I'm asking you to leave." A tense silence fell over the clearing. Sarah was acutely aware of the hidden warriors watching, of how quickly this confrontation could turn deadly. She needed to defuse the situation without bloodshed. Miller, sensing the dangerous undercurrent, placed a restraining hand on the pockmarked man's arm. "We should respect Mrs. Holloway's wishes, Jenkins. She's been a good neighbor to redemption folk." "Neighbor be damned," Jenkins growled. "I lost 2 cousins to Apache raids last year." "If she's hiding them, I'm hiding no one," Sarah interrupted firmly, "and I won't have accusations thrown at me on my own land. Now please leave, or I'll be forced to defend my property." She withdrew the revolver then, not aiming it but holding it visibly at her side, a clear statement of her resolve. The men tensed, hands moving instinctively toward their own weapons. For a breathless moment, violence hung in the air like lightning before a strike. Then Miller raised both hands in a placating gesture. "No need for that, Mrs. Holloway, we're going." He looked at her with a mixture of confusion and disappointment. "But if you change your mind, if you need help, you send word to town." Sarah nodded once. the revolver still firm in her grip. "I will." "Thank you for your concern." Reluctantly, the men mounted their horses. Jenkins and the fourth man glared at her with open suspicion, but with Miller and Dawson unwilling to force the issue, they had little choice but to retreat. As they rode away, Sarah heard Jenkins' voice carry on the morning air. "Tell Hargrove about this. Woman's either gone native or she's being held against her will." Either way, the rest faded into distance, but the threat remained clear. They would return, and next time, it might be with soldiers at their backs. When the riders had disappeared from view, Black Wolf emerged from the shadows of the trees, moving to stand beside Sarah on the porch. "You did well," he said simply. Sarah finally allowed her hand, holding the revolver, to drop, her arm trembling slightly with released tension. "They'll be back." "With the cavalry?" "Yes." His gaze followed the dust trail of the departing riders. "But you have given us time, a day, perhaps two." "To do what?" Sarah asked, the futility of their situation suddenly overwhelming. "You can't fight the entire U.S. Army." Black Wolf's expression remained impassive, but his eyes held a fierce light. "We have fought them for generations. We will fight them for generations more if we must." He looked down at her. "But first we will prepare, and when they come, they will find more than they expected." As the sun climbed higher in the morning sky, Sarah watched the Apache camp spring back to life, preparations resuming with even greater urgency. Whatever came next, whether diplomacy or bloodshed, the die was cast. She had made her choice, had drawn her line in the sand of the Montana Territory, and for better or worse, she would stand by it. By midday, the sun blazed overhead with merciless intensity, baking the earth and wilting the garden plants despite their morning watering. The heat did nothing to slow the preparations within the Apache camp. If anything, it lent greater urgency to their work, as if the rising temperature were a countdown to the confrontation everyone knew was coming. Sarah moved between her cabin and the camp, carrying medical supplies to the Apache healer, a stern-faced woman named Enola, whose initial suspicion had gradually given way to grudging respect as they compared knowledge. Though they shared no common language beyond gestures and a few translated words, they found common ground in their understanding of wounds, herbs, and healing. "This stops bleeding," Sarah explained, showing Enola a bottle of witch hazel extract. She mimed the application, pressing a cloth to an imaginary wound. "For gunshots." Enola nodded, accepting the bottle with careful hands. She reached into her own medicine pouch and withdrew a small deerskin packet, opening it to reveal a fine, greenish powder. "Infection?" she said in halting English, one of the few words they shared. She pointed to a wound, then made a gesture of spreading the powder. "Clean." Sarah recognized it as powdered yarrow, a powerful antiseptic she had used herself. She nodded her understanding, touched by the reciprocal sharing of knowledge. What had begun as Sarah simply offering her supplies had become an exchange between equals. As the afternoon progressed, Sarah noticed Black Wolf moving through the camp, speaking with each warrior individually. Not issuing orders, she realized, but listening, a leader taking counsel from his people before making decisions. It contrasted sharply with the military hierarchy she had observed among white soldiers, where orders flowed only downward. When he approached her cabin, his expression was grave but resolute. Sarah had been checking on Ahiga, who now sat propped up in bed, strong enough to eat solid food and speak in complete sentences. "How is he?" Black Wolf asked, his eyes softening as they fell upon his son. "Much improved," Sarah answered. "The wound is healing clean. No infection." She hesitated, then added honestly, "But he's still weak." Riding would be painful and could reopen the wound. Black Wolf nodded, having expected this assessment. He spoke to Ahiga in Apache, a lengthy exchange that Sarah couldn't follow, though she recognized the serious tone of important matters being discussed. Ahiga responded with equal gravity, occasionally glancing at Sarah as if she were part of the conversation. When they finished, Black Wolf turned to her. "We have decided," he stated simply. "Half our people will leave at nightfall. The children, the elders, most of the women. They will go deeper into the mountains, to places the Bluecoats cannot easily follow." "And the rest?" Sarah asked, though she already suspected the answer. "We stay, 20 warriors, the strongest, and Ahiga." His gaze was direct, unwavering. "And you, if that remains your choice." The moment stretched between them, heavy with implication. Sarah understood that Black Wolf was offering her an out, a chance to flee with those seeking safety, to distance herself from the coming conflict. "I stay," she said firmly. "This is my home, and I gave my word." Something flickered in Black Wolf's eyes, respect perhaps, or concern. Before he could respond, Ahiga spoke up from the bed. "My father believes the soldiers will come tomorrow," he said, his English more fluent than Sarah had previously heard. "They will expect to find us unprepared." Black Wolf nodded. "The men who came this morning will reach the fort by evening. They will tell this Colonel Hargrove that a white woman harbors Apache. He will see this as an opportunity to capture a war chief and rescue a settler in one victory." "And you're going to let him come?" Sarah asked. "Why not leave with the others, avoid the confrontation entirely?" Black Wolf's expression hardened. "Because they would follow, because they would never stop following. Because every time we retreat, they take more land, kill more of our people." His voice remained steady, but Sarah heard the controlled fury beneath it. "At some point, we must stand. We must show them that their actions have consequences." "Even if it means risking everything," Sarah pressed, glancing at Ahiga. "Risking him." "I want to stay, Sarah," Ahiga interjected, his young face solemn. "My friends died. I should be here when the men who killed them face justice." Sarah looked between father and son, seeing the same determination in both faces. She understood then that this wasn't merely about territory or politics, it was about dignity, about refusing to be erased from their own land without resistance. "All right," she said finally, "but we should be smart about this. If they're coming to rescue me, let's use that. Let me speak to them first. They might listen." Black Wolf considered this, then gave a single nod. "Perhaps, but be under no illusion, Sarah Holloway. These men have already decided what they will do. Your words may delay, but they will not prevent." The stark assessment hung in the air between them. Sarah knew he was probably right, yet she had to believe there was still a chance to avoid bloodshed, if not for the sake of the soldiers, then for Ahiga, for the Apache children who deserved a future. "I still have to try," she said quietly. Black Wolf studied her for a long moment, then unexpectedly inclined his head in a gesture almost like a bow. "This is why my son lives. This stubborn hope of yours." He straightened, his leader's mask settling back into place. "The others leave at sunset. We will speak again after they are safely away." With that, he departed, leaving Sarah and Ahiga in a contemplative silence. "He respects you," Ahiga said finally. "That is rare for any white person." Sarah smiled faintly. "I respect him too. He's a good leader, a good father." "He was different before," Ahiga offered. "Before my mother died." He smiled more. The boy's gaze drifted to the window, where they could see Black Wolf directing preparations in the camp. "When she died, something in him went hard. like river mud baked in the sun. Sarah returned to Ahiga's bedside, checking his bandages with gentle hands. Grief changes people. Sometimes it makes us build walls to protect what's left of our hearts. Ahiga nodded thoughtfully. Like you did. After your husband. The perceptive question caught Sarah off guard. She paused in her ministrations, considering how to answer. Yes, she admitted finally. I suppose I did. I came out here to be alone with my memories, to avoid having to explain my sadness to others. Her hands resumed their work, but her thoughts remained on Thomas, on the life they had planned together. Ujun, sometimes it's easier to talk to the wind and the trees than to people who expect you to heal faster than you can. My father is the same, Ahiga said. He speaks to my mother's spirit at night when he thinks I'm sleeping, tells her things he cannot tell others. The intimate revelation formed another thread in the tapestry of understanding that had begun to weave between them. Not just Sarah and Ahiga, but Sarah and Black Wolf. Different in so many ways, yet connected by the universal experience of loss, of rebuilding a life from the fragments left behind. As evening approached, the camp erupted into activity once more. Those who would be leaving gathered their essential belongings, prepared the horses, said solemn goodbyes to those staying behind. Sarah watched from her porch, a witness to the quiet dignity with which they faced separation and danger. Mothers whispered instructions to children, elders blessed warriors with sacred herbs and prayers, couples embraced with the desperate intensity of those who knew they might never see each other again. Yet there were no dramatic scenes, no wailing or public displays of fear, just the understated courage of a people who had faced extermination for generations and still refused to disappear. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the valley, Black Wolf organized the departure. Women, children, and elders mounted horses or gathered travois laden with necessities. A few young warriors would accompany them as protection, though the most seasoned fighters would remain behind. Sarah approached as they prepared to leave, carrying a sack of cornmeal and dried fruits, a contribution to their supplies that felt woefully inadequate against the hardships they might face. Black Wolf's sister, Ahiga's aunt, whom Sarah had met earlier, accepted the offering with solemn gratitude. "You are good woman," she said in halting English. "Keep my nephew safe." "I will," Sarah promised. "Be careful in the mountains." The woman nodded, then surprised Sarah by briefly clasping her hand, a gesture of solidarity that transcended their differences. Then she mounted her horse and took her place in the line of departing Apache. As they moved out, following a narrow game trail that led deeper into the foothills, Sarah felt a presence beside her. Black Wolf stood watching the procession, his face impassive, but his eyes reflecting the setting sun with an intensity that betrayed his emotion. "Will they be safe?" she asked softly. "Safer than here," he replied. "They know places the Bluecoats have never seen, caves and hidden valleys where they can wait until—" He trailed off, leaving the thought unfinished. Until what? Until the soldiers gave up. Until the warriors here were all dead. The uncertainty of their future hung in the air, unspoken yet palpable. They stood side by side, watching until the last rider disappeared into the gathering dusk. Then Black Wolf turned to Sarah, his expression shifting to one of grim determination. "Now we prepare for tomorrow," he said. "Come, there is much to discuss." He led her to what remained of the camp, 20 warriors, each one hand-picked for strength, skill, and loyalty. They gathered around a small fire, careful to keep it low and shielded to avoid creating a beacon visible from a distance. As Sarah joined their circle, she noticed how the warriors regarded her with a new level of acceptance. No longer was she merely the white woman who had saved their chief's son. She was now someone who had chosen to stand with them when she could have fled, who had faced down her own people to protect theirs. Using a Higa as translator when necessary, Black Wolf outlined his strategy for the coming confrontation. The plan was both simple and audacious. They would allow the soldiers to approach the cabin, believing they had the element of surprise. Sarah would greet them, attempting to defuse the situation peacefully. If that failed, as Black Wolf clearly expected it would, the Apache warriors would reveal themselves from carefully chosen positions surrounding the clearing. Not to attack first, Black Wolf emphasized, seeing Sarah's concern, but to show strength, to make them think twice about starting a fight they might not win. "And if they start one anyway?" Sarah asked, the question that had been haunting her since the council fire. Black Wolf's gaze was steady. "Then we finish it." The blunt answer sent a chill through Sarah despite the evening's warmth. She looked around at the faces of the warriors, men who had already lost so much, who expected to lose more before the sun rose again. Their courage humbled her. "I should check on Ahiga," she said after the council concluded. And prepare my own house." Black Wolf walked with her back to the cabin, the night having fully descended now, stars pricking the vast Montana sky. "Your son is remarkable," Sarah said as they walked. "His strength, his wisdom, he has much of you in him." Black Wolf was silent for several steps before responding. "He has his mother's heart, her way of seeing beyond the surface of things." He glanced at Sarah. "Like you do." The unexpected comparison caught her off guard. "I'm not sure what you mean. When you found my son, you did not see an enemy. You saw a child in need." Black Wolf's voice had softened, the hard edges of the war chief momentarily set aside. "That is rare among your people, among mine too, sometimes." "It shouldn't be rare," Sarah replied. "It should be who we all are." Perhaps in a different world. They had reached her porch now, and Black Wolf paused, looking out over the darkened valley. "I have fought the white man's advance for 20 years. I have seen treaties made and broken, promises turned to dust. I have buried too many of my people." His voice remained steady, but Sarah heard the weight of accumulated loss beneath the words. "Tomorrow may bring more burials, or it may bring something else. Something unexpected." "Hope," Sarah suggested quietly. Black Wolf turned to her, his expression visible in the faint light spilling from her cabin window. For the first time, she saw not just the fierce war chief, but the man beneath. A father worried for his son, a leader carrying the future of his people on his shoulders, a human being who had known joy and sorrow just as she had. "Perhaps," he conceded. "Though hope is a luxury in times of war, it's a necessity," Sarah countered gently. "Without it, why fight at all?" The question hung between them, unanswered but not dismissed. Then Black Wolf reached out, his hand hesitating briefly before touching the silver medallion that still hung at Sarah's throat. "Shoshone work," he noted. "A protection symbol." Sarah nodded. "A gift." "From a woman my husband helped once. It has strong medicine," Black Wolf said, his fingers withdrawing. "But tomorrow, you may need more than medicine. You may need courage beyond what you know you possess." "I'm afraid," Sarah admitted, the confession easier in the darkness, not of dying exactly, but of failing, of making things worse for Ahiga, for all of you. "Fear is wisdom if you listen to it correctly," Black Wolf replied. "It tells you to be careful, not to be paralyzed." He looked toward the cabin where Ahiga was presumably resting. "My son believes in you. That is enough for me." The simple statement touched Sarah deeply. Coming from a man who had every reason to distrust her, it felt like a benediction. "Thank you," she said softly, "for trusting me with him, with all of this." Black Wolf nodded once, then stepped back. "Rest while you can. Tomorrow comes quickly." As he melted into the darkness, returning to his warriors, Sarah remained on the porch for a long moment, absorbing the night's peace before the storm that would surely break with dawn. Inside, she found Ahiga awake, propped up on pillows, his eyes alert and watchful as she entered. "They've gone?" he asked. "Yes, to safety, we hope." She moved to his bedside, checking his bandages one more time. "How do you feel?" "Strong enough," he asserted, though the pallor of his skin belied the claim. "For tomorrow." Sarah sat beside him, smoothing the blanket over his legs. "Ahiga, tomorrow could be dangerous, very dangerous. Your father's plan is the only way," Ahiga interrupted firmly. "You must understand, Sarah. Sometimes standing your ground is the only peace you can make." The wisdom in his young voice struck her anew. "When did you get so old?" she asked with a sad smile. "Apache children grow up fast," he replied simply. "We have to." Sarah's heart ached at the truth of it. This boy, forced into premature wisdom by the harsh realities of a world that saw him as expendable, as an obstacle to be removed. "Try to sleep," she told him gently. "I'll be right here." As Ahiga drifted into slumber, Sarah moved about the cabin, making her own preparations. She packed a small bag with essentials, her father's medical book, Thomas's letters, a locket containing a snippet of his hair, a few items of clothing. These she tucked under the bed, ready to grab if they needed to flee quickly. Next, she cleaned and loaded both the shotgun and the revolver, placing them where they would be accessible but not immediately visible. Not that she intended to use them against the soldiers, but their presence might add weight to her words when she attempted to negotiate. Finally, she sat at her small table and, by the light of a single candle, penned a letter. Not a will exactly, but a testament, an account of what had happened, of the choices she had made and why. If tomorrow went badly, at least the truth would remain, a counterpoint to whatever story the army might tell. She wrote of finding Ahiga, of saving his life, of meeting Black Wolf and his warriors. She detailed the murder of the Apache boys, the military's apparent campaign to eliminate the tribe from their ancestral lands. She explained her decision to stand with them, not against her country, but for a justice that transcended borders and bloodlines. When she finished, she sealed the letter and addressed it to her sister in Boston, the only family she had left. Then she tucked it into her Bible, where it would be found if she did not survive to send it. These grim tasks completed, Sarah extinguished the candle and moved to the rocking chair beside Ahiga's bed. Through the window, she could see stars scattered across the vast Montana sky like diamonds on black velvet. The same stars shone down on the soldiers who would come tomorrow, on the Apache families fleeing into the mountains, on settlements and cities across a nation still healing from its own terrible civil war. How strange, she thought, that under such a magnificent, unified sky, people could remain so divided, so determined to see others as enemies rather than fellow travelers on the same precious earth. As she drifted into an uneasy sleep, Sarah's hand closed around the silver medallion at her throat. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. But tonight, in this moment of suspended time between decision and consequence, she felt a curious peace. The peace that comes from knowing you have chosen your path with a clear heart and open eyes, whatever the cost may be. Sarah woke to the soft glow of pre-dawn light filtering through her window. For a moment, Disorientation clouded her mind. Why was she in the rocking chair instead of her bed? Then reality crashed back as her eyes fell on Ahiga, sleeping peacefully beneath her quilt, and the events of the past 2 days crystallized in her memory. Today was the day the soldiers would come. She rose quietly, her body stiff from the awkward night in the chair. Outside, a light mist clung to the ground, shrouding the valley in ghostly white. The Apache camp was invisible from her window, the warriors having dispersed to strategic positions throughout the surrounding terrain. Only the faintest wisp of smoke from a carefully banked fire betrayed any human presence beyond her cabin. Sarah moved with deliberate calm, stoking the fire in the hearth, putting coffee on to boil, washing her face in the basin of cool water, routine tasks that belied the extraordinary circumstances. She selected her best dress, a navy blue cotton with small white flowers reserved for trips to town or special occasions. If she was to face down the United States cavalry today, she would do so looking like the respectable widow she was. As she pinned her hair neatly at the nape of her neck, Ahiga stirred, his eyes opening to find her already dressed and prepared. "They're coming today," he said. Not a question. "Yes," Sarah replied, bringing him a cup of water. "How do you feel?" Ahiga sat up carefully, wincing slightly, but with more strength than he'd shown the previous day. "Better? Strong enough?" Sarah checked his bandages, pleased to find the wound healing well with no signs of infection. Still, he was in no condition for strenuous activity, certainly not for riding or fighting. "You'll stay inside," she told him firmly. "No matter what happens, no matter what you hear, promise me?" The boy's eyes flashed with momentary defiance, but he nodded reluctantly. "I promise, unless you are in danger." Sarah decided that was the best assurance she was likely to get. She helped him dress in clean clothing, a simple cotton shirt of her husband's that hung loosely on his small frame, but was less distinctive than his Apache garments. If things went badly, appearing less foreign might offer him some small protection. They ate a simple breakfast of cornbread and coffee, neither speaking much. The weight of anticipation hung in the air, making ordinary conversation seem trivial. As the sun cleared the eastern mountains, flooding the valley with golden light that burned away the morning mist, a shadow appeared in the doorway. Black Wolf stood there, his face painted with red and black stripes, war paint, Sarah realized with a tightening in her chest. Gone was the buckskin shirt from yesterday, replaced by a more traditional vest that left his arms bare except for leather bands at his biceps. His hair was braided tightly, adorned with a single eagle feather. At his waist hung a cavalry revolver alongside his traditional knife. Despite the war paint, his eyes were calm as they met Sarah's. "They come," he said simply. Sarah nodded, her mouth suddenly dry. "How many?" 30 riders, more behind them, moving slower, wagon, maybe cannon. Black Wolf's assessment was delivered with clinical detachment. "But the first group will reach your land within the hour." 48 hours ago, Sarah would have found the prospect of 30 armed men approaching her homestead terrifying. Now, it seemed almost inevitable, as if her life had been moving toward this moment without her knowledge. "I'll speak to them first," she said, as much to reassure herself as to confirm their plan. "Try to make them understand." Black Wolf's expression suggested his doubt about the efficacy of words, but he nodded. "My warriors are positioned. They will not show themselves unless necessary." He moved to Ahiga's side, speaking rapidly in Apache. The boy responded with equal intensity, clearly frustrated by his father's instructions. Finally, he subsided, accepting whatever had been decided. Black Wolf turned back to Sarah. "He will stay hidden in the root cellar. Safer than the cabin if shooting starts. Sarah hadn't thought of the root cellar, a small space beneath a trapdoor in her kitchen floor where she stored vegetables through the winter. It was a good suggestion. Bullets were unlikely to penetrate its earthen walls. "I'll help him down there when it's time," she agreed. Black Wolf hesitated, then reached into a pouch at his waist. He withdrew a small object wrapped in soft buckskin, offering it to Sarah. "For protection," he said as she unwrapped it, "from my people, from me." In her palm lay a small carving of a bear, no larger than her thumb, made from some dark stone that gleamed in the morning light. Intricate designs were etched into its surface, highlighted with red pigment. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, genuinely touched. But I can't take something so valuable." "Not valuable," Black Wolf corrected. "Sacred. It belonged to my father and his father before him. It has protected my family for generations." His eyes held hers with unexpected intensity. "Today, you are family." The simple declaration struck Sarah deeply. She closed her fingers around the talisman, understanding the profound trust the gesture represented. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'll keep it safe." Black Wolf nodded once, then turned to leave. At the doorway, he paused, looking back at his son and then at Sarah. "Whatever comes," he said, "know that you have earned a place in the stories our people will tell. The woman who stood between worlds." Then he was gone, moving silently into the landscape like a shadow, rejoining the darkness that birthed it. Sarah slipped the stone bear into her pocket alongside her father's watch, drawing strength from these talismans of different worlds. Then she helped Ahiga to the kitchen, opened the trapdoor to the root cellar, and carefully assisted him down the narrow ladder. "Stay quiet," she instructed, arranging a blanket and pillow in the cramped space. "No matter what you hear, trust that I will do everything possible to keep everyone safe." Ahiga gripped her hand suddenly. "Sarah," he said urgently, "if things go wrong, if my father falls, tell our people that Black Wolf died standing, not kneeling. Tell them he kept his promise to my mother." The solemnity of the request brought tears to Sarah's eyes. "I will," she promised, "but it won't come to that. I won't let it." She closed the trapdoor, sliding a small rug over it for additional concealment. Then she moved to the porch, settling into her rocking chair with a book open in her lap, a picture of frontier domesticity that belied the 20 Apache warriors hidden in the surrounding terrain, the wounded boy beneath her floor, the revolver concealed in the pocket of her apron, and she waited. They came as Black Wolf had predicted, a column of cavalry soldiers riding two abreast, dust rising from beneath their horses, hooves, sunlight glinting off rifle barrels and brass buttons. At their head rode a tall figure on a chestnut stallion, his posture rigid with military bearing. Even at a distance, Sarah could sense the authority that radiated from him. Colonel Hargrove, she presumed, come to rescue her from the savages or punish her for harboring them. Sarah remained seated, forcing her hands to stay steady on the book in her lap. She would not show fear, would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her trembling or uncertain. The column halted at the edge of her property. After a brief conference, the leader and two others, an officer and a civilian whom Sarah recognized with a jolt as Jenkins, the hostile man from yesterday's encounter, broke away, approaching her cabin while the rest of the troops remained in formation. As they drew closer, Sarah took the measure of Colonel James Hargrove. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 40, with close-cropped blonde hair beneath his cavalry hat and a neatly trimmed mustache. His uniform was immaculate, his posture perfect, but it was his eyes that commanded attention, pale blue and utterly cold, like chips of winter ice. They swept over her property with clinical assessment, missing nothing. Sarah rose as they reached her porch, setting her book aside and smoothing her skirts. "Oh, good morning, gentlemen," she said, her voice steady and clear. "What brings the cavalry to my doorstep?" Hargrove removed his hat with practiced courtesy that didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Holloway, I presume. I'm Colonel James Hargrove, 7th Cavalry. This is Lieutenant Carson and Mr. Jenkins, whom I believe you've met." Jenkins glowered at her, clearly displeased that she appeared unharmed and in control of the situation. She ignored him, focusing on Hargrove. "I know why you're here, Colonel," she said directly, "and I can assure you I'm in no danger and require no rescue." Hargrove's expression remained polite, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "I'm afraid that's for me to determine, ma'am. We have reports that a large group of hostile Apache have been occupying your property. As an officer of the United States Army, I have a duty to investigate such reports and ensure the safety of American citizens. The Apache who were here were invited guests on my property," Sarah replied firmly. "Most have moved on. Those who remain are here with my full knowledge and consent." Jenkins spat on the ground. "Told you, Colonel. Woman's gone native. Probably been out here alone too long. Lost her senses." "That's enough, Jenkins," Hargrove said sharply, though his eyes never left Sarah's face. "Mrs. Holloway, perhaps you're unaware of the situation. These Apache are wanted for numerous attacks on settlements and military patrols. They're led by a war chief known as Black Wolf, one of the most dangerous hostiles in the territory." Sarah maintained her composure. "Indeed, I'm fully aware of who they are, Colonel. I'm also aware that 3 days ago, your men shot a 12-year-old Apache boy who was hunting with his friends. I'm aware that those friends were later found murdered and mutilated. I'm aware that what you call pacification looks remarkably like extermination to those on the receiving end." Her words landed like stones dropped in still water. Lieutenant Carson shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Jenkins' face darkened with anger, but Hargrove's expression remained unchanged, save for a slight tightening around his mouth. "You seem remarkably well informed for a widow living in isolation," he observed coolly, "and remarkably sympathetic to those who would gladly take your scalp under different circumstances. I judge people by their actions, Colonel, not by the stories others tell about them," Sarah replied. "Black Wolf came here looking for his wounded son, the boy I found bleeding on my porch and treated with my own hands. He's shown me nothing but respect. Can you say the same about your men's treatment of Apache children?" Hargrove dismounted in one fluid motion, handing his reins to Lieutenant Carson. He approached the porch steps, stopping just short of them, close enough for conversation, not so close as to invade her space. A calculated move, Sarah realized, designed to appear reasonable. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone, "I understand that living alone out here can be challenging. It's natural to form attachments, even to those who might not have your best interests at heart, but I assure you, these people are not your friends. They're using you, your property, your good nature, for their own purposes." The condescension in his tone made Sarah's blood boil, but she kept her expression neutral. "And what purposes would those be, Colonel? Trying to protect their children, attempting to preserve what little remains of their homeland, refusing to be rounded up like cattle and marched to a reservation where they'll likely starve or die of disease." Hargrove's facade of patience cracked slightly. "These are matters of national policy, Mrs. Holloway, not the concern of a frontier widow. Now, I've been patient, but my duty is clear. I must search your property for hostile Apache. You can cooperate, or you can be detained for interfering with military operations. The choice is yours." Sarah felt the weight of the moment pressing down upon her. Somewhere in the surrounding landscape, Black Wolf and his warriors were watching, waiting for her signal, ready to reveal themselves if she gave the word. But once that happened, there would be no turning back. My husband fought for the Union, Colonel, she said quietly. He believed in a nation governed by laws, not by the whims of men with guns. This is my property. You have no warrant, no legal authority to search it without my permission, which I do not give. Hargrove's pale eyes turned glacial. Mrs. Holloway, we are on the frontier. The niceties of Eastern courtrooms have little relevance here. I have the authority granted by the United States Army to pursue hostile forces wherever they may be found. He stepped onto the first porch step. Now, I'll ask once more, will you cooperate, or must I place you under military custody? Sarah stood her ground, though her heart hammered against her ribs. And I'll tell you once more, you have no right to be here. The Apache on my land are here as my guests, under my protection. If you want them, you'll have to go through me. That can be arranged, Jenkins muttered, his hand moving to his pistol. Hargrove silenced him with a look, then turned back to Sarah. Very well, Lieutenant Carson, escort Mrs. Holloway to the wagon. She'll be transported back to the fort for her own protection until this situation is resolved. As Carson dismounted and moved toward the porch, Sarah made her decision. She raised her hand to her hair as if to adjust a pin, the signal she and Black Wolf had agreed upon. I wouldn't take another step, Lieutenant, she said clearly. You're surrounded. For a moment, nothing happened. Hargrove's expression shifted to something like pity, as if confirming his suspicion that she was delusional. Then, one by one, Apache warriors materialized from the landscape, rising from behind rocks, stepping out from trees, emerging from the tall grass. Within moments, 20 painted warriors stood, revealed, arrows nocked, rifles aimed, silent and deadly as they encircled the soldiers. From behind the large oak tree at the edge of the clearing stepped Black Wolf himself, his presence commanding immediate attention. He made no aggressive move, but the power in his stance, the authority in his bearing, made it clear who controlled this situation. Oh, Jesus Christ, breathed Lieutenant Carson, his hand frozen halfway to his sidearm. Hargrove's face betrayed nothing, but Sarah saw his eyes dart quickly around the clearing, calculating odds, assessing threats. She knew what he saw, his three-man advance party hopelessly outnumbered, his main force too far away to provide immediate assistance. It's Colonel Hargrove, Sarah said into the tense silence. May I introduce Chief Black Wolf of the Chiricahua Apache. He'd like to discuss the matter of his son, who was shot without provocation by men under your command. Black Wolf stepped forward, his movements deliberate and controlled. He stopped several paces from the soldiers, close enough to be heard without shouting, far enough to avoid appearing threatening. "Oh, Bluecoat Chief," he said, his English clear and strong, "you come to this woman's land uninvited. You threaten her. This is not the action of an honorable man." Hargrove's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "I came to rescue her from hostiles. It appears I was mistaken about who needed rescuing." "No rescue needed," Black Wolf replied evenly. "No one here is prisoner." "But you?" His eyes hardened. "You must answer for the blood of our children." "I don't know what you're talking about," Hargrove said, though a flicker in his eyes suggested otherwise. 3 days ago," Sarah interjected, "Ahiga, Black Wolf's son, and 2 other boys were hunting near the eastern ridge. They were shot by white men, possibly soldiers. Ahiga managed to reach my cabin. I removed the bullet and treated his wound." Her voice hardened. "And the other 2 boys were found dead, mutilated, displayed as warnings. Do you deny knowledge of this, Colonel?" Hargrove's expression remained impassive. Rogue elements sometimes take matters into their own hands. If soldiers were involved, they acted without orders. Convenient, Sarah said coldly. Black Wolf stepped closer, his presence intensifying. You are their leader. Their actions are your responsibility. For the first time, uncertainty crossed Hargrove's face, not fear for his own safety, but the dawning realization that he was not in control of this situation. His men were outnumbered, the Apache held the tactical advantage, and the white woman he'd come to rescue was clearly aligned with them. "What do you want?" he asked finally. His voice clipped. Black Wolf's eyes never wavered. "Justice for our dead. Your word that soldiers will not hunt our children, a territory of our own where we can live in peace." "I don't have the authority to make such promises," Hargrove replied stiffly. "Then find someone who does," Sarah interjected, "because this cycle of violence benefits no one, not the army, not the settlers, certainly not the Apache." Hargrove's cold eyes turned to her. "You presume a great deal, Mrs. Holloway. Interfering in military matters, harboring hostiles, these are serious offenses. Your status as a widow won't protect you from the consequences." "Are you threatening me, Colonel?" Sarah asked quietly. "On my own land?" "I'm stating facts," he replied. "The army doesn't look kindly on those who side against their own kind. My kind are those who believe in justice," Sarah shot back. "Who don't murder children or drive people from their ancestral homes." The standoff might have continued indefinitely if not for what happened next. A sound came from inside the cabin, a thump followed by a muffled cry. Sarah's heart froze. Ahiga, trying to climb out of the root cellar, had apparently fallen. Hargrove's head snapped toward the cabin door. "Someone's inside," he said sharply. His hand moved to his sidearm. "Lieutenant, check the cabin." "No!" Sarah moved to block the porch steps. "Stay where you are." But it was too late. The dynamic had shifted. Hargrove drew his pistol, not aiming it at Sarah, but holding it ready. "Step aside, Mrs. Holloway." "Now, the boy is inside," Black Wolf said, his voice dangerously quiet. "My son." "The one your men shot." Hargrove's eyes narrowed. "The hostile who escaped." "All the more reason to secure the premises." Sarah stood her ground. "He's a wounded child, Colonel, hardly a threat." "That remains to be seen," Hargrove replied coldly. He nodded to Carson. "Lieutenant, move Mrs. Holloway aside and search the cabin." As Carson moved forward, Sarah felt a shift in the air, the Apache warriors tensing, drawing bowstrings tighter, adjusting their aim. Black Wolf had gone utterly still, a stillness she recognized as the prelude to explosive action. They stood on the precipice of violence. One wrong move, Carson forcing his way past her, Hargrove raising his pistol, an Apache warrior loosing an arrow, and blood would flow, perhaps all their blood. In that crystalline moment of decision, Sarah did the only thing she could think of. She reached into her pocket and withdrew the stone bear that Black Wolf had given her, holding it up between herself and Hargrove. "Enough," she said, her voice ringing with authority she didn't know she possessed. "Look at this, Colonel. Do you know what it is?" Hargrove frowned, momentarily thrown by the non sequitur. "Some kind of Indian trinket. It's a sacred object, passed through Black Wolf's family for generations," Sarah explained, keeping her voice steady. "This morning, he gave it to me. Do you understand what that means? It means trust. It means recognition. It means he sees me as family." She lowered her hand, clutching the carving tightly. When was the last time you offered such trust to someone different from yourself?" The unexpected question seemed to penetrate Hargrove's military bearing. For a brief moment, confusion flickered across his face. Sarah pressed her advantage. We have a choice right now, all of us. We can fight and die here today, adding more bodies to a conflict that's already claimed too many, or we can try something different. Something harder than fighting, but ultimately more worthwhile. What would you suggest, Mrs. Holloway? Hargrove asked, a note of genuine curiosity breaking through his professional detachment. Talk, she said simply. Listen. Recognize that the people you've been ordered to subdue are just that, people. With families, with dreams, with rights to the land they've inhabited for generations. Pretty words, Hargrove said, though his pistol had lowered slightly. But they don't change the reality of our situation. No, Sarah agreed. Only actions can do that. She took a deep breath, then made a decision that might cost her everything. I'll show you a Higa. You'll see a wounded boy, not a hostile. And then you'll leave my property and report to your superiors that the situation here requires diplomatic intervention, not military force. Hargrove's eyes narrowed. And if I refuse? Blackwolf stepped forward, his presence impossible to ignore. Then none of your men leave this valley alive. His voice was calm, matter of fact. You might kill some of us, perhaps many, but not all. And those who remain will ensure your blue coats are remembered only by the vultures who feast on your bones. The stark threat hung in the air. Hargrove looked from Blackwolf to Sarah, then to the surrounding warriors whose arrows and rifles remained trained on his men with unwavering focus. Something shifted in his expression, not surrender exactly, but a strategic reassessment. Very well, Mrs. Holloway, show me this boy. Then we'll discuss terms. Sarah nodded, relief washing through her, though she kept it from her face. Wait here, she instructed. I'll bring him out. As she turned toward the cabin, she caught Blackwolf's eye. A silent communication passed between them, concern from him, reassurance from her. Then she entered the cabin, closing the door behind her. Inside, she found Ahiga struggling to climb from the root cellar, his face pale with pain and effort. What are you doing? She whispered urgently, helping him back to the floor. You promised to stay hidden. I heard voices, he gasped. Soldiers, I thought you were in danger. Sarah's heart swelled with affection for this brave, foolish boy. I'm fine, she assured him, but now I need your help. The colonel is outside. I've convinced him to see you, to understand that you're not a threat. Will you come with me? Ahiga's eyes widened, but he nodded without hesitation. I am not afraid. I know you're not, Sarah said softly. That's why this might work. She helped him to his feet, supporting him as they moved slowly toward the door. Before opening it, she looked down at him, this child who had changed everything when he collapsed on her porch 3 nights ago. Whatever happens, she told him, remember that you've already won. You've survived. You've brought your father and me together in common cause. You've shown more courage than men 3 times your age. Ahiga straightened as much as his wound allowed, dignity evident in every line of his young body. I am ready. Sarah opened the door, and together they stepped onto the porch to face whatever judgment awaited them in the clear Montana morning. Time seemed to slow as Sarah and Ahiga emerged onto the porch. The tableau before them remained frozen in tense anticipation. Colonel Hargrove and his men on one side, Blackwolf and his warriors on the other, weapons at the ready. The morning sun casting long shadows across the clearing, as if nature itself were drawing battle lines on the Montana earth. All eyes turned to the wounded boy, who stood tall despite the pain evident in his drawn features. In Thomas's oversized shirt, with his hair falling loose around his shoulders, Ahiga looked both vulnerable and dignified. A child forced to stand before men who would decide his future, his people's future. with decisions made in this fragile moment. Sarah kept one supportive arm around his shoulders as they faced Colonel Hargrove. The military man's cold eyes assessed Ahiga with clinical detachment, taking in the bandages visible beneath the loose shirt, the pallor of his skin, the unmistakable youth of his face. "This is Ahiga," Sarah said, her voice steady and clear in the morning air. "Black Wolf's son. The boy your men shot while he was hunting with his friends." Ahiga met Hargrove's gaze without flinching, though Sarah could feel the slight trembling of his body against her side, not from fear, she sensed, but from the effort of standing when he should still be abed. "How old are you, boy?" Hargrove asked abruptly. 12 summers, Ahiga replied in English that was accented but clear. Soon 13. Something flickered across Hargrove's face, a shadow of discomfort, perhaps, or the first crack in his armor of military detachment. His eyes moved to the bandages, then back to Ahiga's face. "Who shot you?" he demanded. "Men on horses," Ahiga answered steadily. "Bluecoats, like you, they did not warn us, did not speak, just fired." His voice remained level, but his eyes hardened. "They killed my friends, cut their hair. Left them for animals." Jenkins shifted uncomfortably, not meeting anyone's eyes. Lieutenant Carson stared straight ahead, his expression rigid but his complexion paling notably. And Hargrove, something changed in the colonel's demeanor, a subtle shift in posture, a tightening around his eyes. "And if soldiers under my command committed such acts," he said carefully, "they did so without orders and will face military justice." "Is that all you have to say?" Sarah asked, unable to keep the edge from her voice. "A child is shot, his friends murdered and mutilated, and you offer bureaucratic platitudes." Black Wolf stepped forward, his movement drawing all eyes. "My son lives only because of this woman's hands and heart. The others..." His voice caught, a rare display of emotion. "Key and Tarek, they had mothers who now wail in the night, fathers who seek blood payment, sisters and brothers who learn to hate the blue coats earlier than they should." He moved to stand beside his son, placing a hand gently on Ahiga's head in a gesture of blessing and protection. "This is what your pacification creates, Colonel. Not peace, only more war, more death. More hate passed to the next generation." The truth of his words hung in the air, impossible to dismiss. Even Jenkins, who had been so eager for confrontation earlier, now looked troubled, as if seeing for the first time the human consequences of policies discussed in abstract terms in military headquarters. Hargrove removed his hat, running a hand through his short blonde hair, a surprisingly human gesture from a man who had seemed carved from ice. When he spoke, his voice had lost some of its military crispness. "What would you have me do? I have orders. The settlement of these territories continues whether any of us wish it or not. The Apache way of life." He gestured broadly at the surrounding landscape. "It cannot survive against what's coming. Cannot or will not be allowed to," Sarah challenged quietly. Before Hargrove could respond, Ahiga spoke, his young voice carrying unexpected authority. "We do not ask to stop time," he said, each word carefully chosen. "We ask to live, to hunt, to teach our children our ways, on land that has been ours since before your grandfathers were born." He swayed slightly, and Sarah tightened her support. "Is this so much?" The simple question, asked without rancor or rhetoric, seemed to strike Hargrove more powerfully than any threat could have. He looked at the boy, then at Black Wolf, then at the surrounding warriors whose weapons remained trained on his men who could have killed them at any point but had chosen restraint. "No," he said finally, surprising everyone with the admission, "no, it is not so much. But I don't have the authority to grant such things." "Then who does?" Sarah pressed. Who speaks for the United States here, if not you? Hargrove replaced his hat, his military bearing returning, though something had fundamentally shifted in his demeanor. There's an Indian Affairs Commissioner arriving at the fort next week, Augustus Blackwood. He has the authority to negotiate territorial boundaries, to establish protected lands. Blackwolf's expression revealed nothing, but Sarah sensed a quickening of interest. This man, he has power to make binding agreements. Yes, Hargrove confirmed, signed by the president himself. A moment of consideration passed before Blackwolf spoke again. Then we will meet with him, but not at your fort. Here. He gestured to the surrounding land. And neutral ground, with her as witness, he nodded toward Sarah. Hargrove frowned, considering the proposal. Blackwood won't come without military escort. 5 men, Blackwolf counted. No more. We will bring the same number. It was surreal, Sarah thought, watching these 2 men, enemies by circumstance, leaders by nature, begin the delicate process of negotiation where moments before bloodshed had seemed inevitable. And until then, Hargrove asked, the practical soldier reasserting himself. Until then, you and your men return to your fort, Blackwolf stated firmly. My people remain where they are, hunting only what they need, avoiding white settlements. No raids, no attacks, a peace of waiting. Hargrove nodded slowly. And Mrs. Holloway? I stay here, Sarah interjected before either man could speak for her. This is my home. And I will witness whatever agreement you reach to ensure both sides honor their word. A hint of reluctant admiration crossed Hargrove's face. You're either very brave or very foolish, ma'am. Perhaps both, Sarah replied with a small smile. But I've made my choice. Ahiga swayed again, more noticeably this time, his strength finally failing him. Sarah and Blackwolf both moved to support him, their hands meeting at the boy's shoulders in a moment of unexpected unity. He needs to rest, Sarah said. We've made our point, I think. Blackwolf nodded, lifting his son gently into his arms despite Ahiga's weak protests. The boy seemed suddenly younger, the brave front giving way to the child beneath as he leaned his head against his father's chest. 1 week, Hargrove said decisively. I'll bring Blackwood here in 1 week's time. Until then, the terms you proposed stand. He turned to Lieutenant Carson. We're withdrawing. Signal the main column to hold position. As Carson moved to comply, Jenkins stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. You can't be serious, Colonel. Treating with hostiles, letting this woman dictate terms. It's enough, Jenkins. Hargrove cut him off sharply. And these people could have killed us all at any point. Instead, they chose to talk. That tells me more about their intentions than all your fear-mongering. He fixed the civilian with a cold stare. Unless you'd prefer to stay here and continue this discussion without military protection? Jenkins paled, then scowled, but fell silent. Hargrove turned back to Sarah and Blackwolf. 1 week, he repeated. Any hostile action from either side before then voids our agreement. Understood, Blackwolf replied with solemn dignity. With a final assessing look at Sarah, Hargrove mounted his horse, signaling his men to withdraw. They departed as they had come, in orderly formation, though the rigid military bearing had softened somewhat, several soldiers glancing back with expressions more curious than hostile. As the dust of their departure settled, the tension that had held the clearing in its grip for so long finally broke. Apache warriors lowered their weapons, some sinking to the ground in relief, others approaching Blackwolf with questions, concerns, criticisms of the agreement he had made. Sarah watched it all with a curious sense of detachment, as if the events of the past hour had happened to someone else. Only when Black Wolf approached, still carrying Ahiga, did she fully return to herself. "He needs to lie down," she said, practicality reasserting itself. "The wound could reopen if he's not careful." Black Wolf nodded, following her into the cabin. Together, they settled Ahiga back onto the bed, Sarah checking his bandages while Black Wolf spoke to him softly in Apache. The boy's eyes were heavy with exhaustion, but a smile touched his lips as he looked between his father and Sarah. "You did not fight," he murmured, switching to English as his eyes began to close. "Words better than arrows. Rest now," Sarah told him gently, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. "Well, you've done more than enough for one day." As Ahiga drifted into sleep, Sarah and Black Wolf moved to the porch, both needing a moment to process all that had transpired. The morning was advancing, the sun climbing higher in the Montana sky, birds returning to their songs now that the threat of violence had passed. "Will it work?" Sarah asked finally, breaking the companionable silence. This meeting with the commissioner, Black Wolf gazed out over the landscape, his expression thoughtful. "Perhaps, perhaps not, but it is a beginning." He turned to her. "You gave us that, a chance to be heard." "I did what anyone should have done," Sarah demurred. "No!" Black Wolf countered firmly. "What you did, saving my son, standing against your own people, risking everything, these are not common actions." His eyes held hers with quiet intensity. "They are the actions of someone with a true heart, a brave heart." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words, more meaningful than any praise she had received in her life. "What happens now, until the commissioner arrives?" "My people will return," Black Wolf said. "For those who fled to the mountains, we will prepare, gather our elders and wise ones to speak with this Blackwood." A hint of weariness showed through his stoic demeanor. "And we will hope that this time, words on paper mean something." Sarah understood his skepticism. History had given the Apache little reason to trust white men's promises, yet what choice did they have but to try? "I'll help however I can," she promised. "Blackwood will hear the truth from me as well, about what I've seen, what I know of your people." Black Wolf nodded, gratitude evident in his eyes even as he maintained his dignified reserve. "The stone I gave you," he said unexpectedly. "It protected you, as I knew it would." Sarah reached into her pocket, withdrawing the small bear carving. It seemed to glow warmly in the morning light, the red pigment in its etched designs vivid against the dark stone. "It's still yours," she said, offering it back to him, "now that the danger has passed." Black Wolf closed her fingers around the talisman, his touch gentle but firm. "No, it is yours now, a reminder of what happened here, of the bridge you built between our worlds." His hand lingered on hers a moment longer than necessary. "Keep it. Pass it to your children someday, so they remember this story." The implication that she might have children someday, that her life might still hold possibilities beyond solitary widowhood, touched something deep within Sarah. For 3 years since Thomas's death, she had existed rather than lived, finding purpose only in survival and self-sufficiency. Now, in the most unlikely circumstances, she had rediscovered what it meant to be part of something larger than herself. "Thank you," she said simply, knowing he would understand all she couldn't articulate. Black Wolf inclined his head in acknowledgement, then straightened as several of his warriors approached, clearly waiting to speak with him. With a final nod to Sarah, he moved to join them, resuming his role as leader, as the one who would guide his people through whatever came next. Sarah remained on the porch, watching as the Apache camp gradually returned to life around her homestead. Women and children would be returning soon from their mountain refuge. Decisions would need to be made, preparations undertaken for the coming negotiation. Her quiet existence had been irrevocably transformed, and yet she realized with quiet certainty she wouldn't change what had happened, wouldn't undo the moment when she'd found a wounded boy on her porch and made the choice that altered everything. For in saving Ahiga, she had in some sense saved herself, had awakened from the half-life she'd been living since Thomas's death and rediscovered her capacity for courage, for conviction, for connection. Inside the cabin, Ahiga slept peacefully, his young body focused on healing. In the clearing, Black Wolf conferred with his warriors, already planning for the uncertain future. And on her porch, Sarah Holloway stood between these worlds, no longer merely an observer of life, but a participant in its most profound currents. The stone bear warmed in her palm as she closed her fingers around it, drawing strength from its solid presence. 1 week until Blackwood arrived, 1 week to prepare for a negotiation that might determine the fate of the Apache in this territory for generations to come. 1 week to consider what role she would play in the story still unfolding around her. Whatever came next, whether lasting peace or renewed conflict, whether victory or compromise, Sarah knew she had found her place in a narrative larger than herself. By one simple act of compassion, she had helped create a moment of possibility where before there had been only inevitability. As the morning sun bathed the Montana landscape in golden light, Sarah looked out over what had once been her solitary homestead, now transformed into a place of convergence, of connection, of hope. Black Wolf caught her eye across the clearing and raised his hand in a gesture that was neither white nor Apache, but simply human, an acknowledgement between equals who had found common ground in the most unexpected circumstances. Sarah returned the gesture, a smile touching her lips for perhaps the first time in years. Then she turned and went inside to tend to Ahiga, to begin preparations for the gathering to come, to continue the work of building bridges in a world determined to erect walls. Behind her, the door remained open, a symbol of the path she had chosen, the threshold she had crossed, and the future that awaited them all on the other side of understanding. 3 years later, Sarah Holloway stood on the same porch, watching a very different scene unfold before her. Where once there had been a temporary Apache camp, now stood a permanent settlement, a unique community where Apache teepees and more permanent wooden structures stood side by side, where gardens flourished alongside traditional hunting grounds, where children of different heritages played together in the Montana sunshine. The territorial agreement negotiated that fateful week had been imperfect, as all such compromises are. Commissioner Blackwood had been skeptical at first, clearly expecting to dictate terms rather than engage in genuine negotiation. But faced with Black Wolf's dignified eloquence, Ahiga's powerful testimony, and Sarah's unwavering support, he had eventually agreed to establish a protected territory, smaller than the Apache wanted, but larger than the military had intended to concede. Colonel Hargrove, to everyone's surprise, had become an unexpected ally. Perhaps moved by what he had witnessed at Sarah's homestead, or perhaps simply a practical soldier recognizing the futility of endless conflict, he had supported the agreement and enforced its terms rigorously. The soldiers who had shot Ahiga had been identified and court-martialed, a small justice, but significant in its acknowledgement of wrong. Not everyone had accepted the new arrangement, of course. Some settlers still viewed the Apache with fear and hostility. Some warriors had broken away from Black Wolf's leadership, unwilling to accept any compromise with the white government. Tensions flared occasionally, requiring patient diplomacy to resolve. But here, in this small corner of the Montana territory, something remarkable had taken root. A community founded on mutual respect, rather than domination, on coexistence rather than extinction. "Sarah!" Ahiga's voice broke into her reflections. At 15 now, he had grown tall and strong, all traces of his wound healed, though he carried the experience in his eyes, in the seriousness with which he approached his responsibilities as Black Wolf's son and heir. "Father says to tell you the council is gathering." Sarah nodded, smoothing her skirts, no longer the severe garments of a grieving widow, but clothes that incorporated both her own cultural heritage and elements of Apache design, a visual representation of the bridge she had become. "I'll be right there," she promised. As Ahiga turned to go, he paused, looking back at her with a smile that transformed his solemn features. "He also said to remind you that you promised to tell the story again tonight, for the children." Sarah smiled in return, knowing which story he meant. The tale of a storm, a wounded boy, and a woman who made a choice that changed everything. The children of the settlement never tired of hearing it, though they had memorized every detail, every word. "I won't forget," she assured him. When Ahiga had gone, Sarah reached into her pocket, fingers closing around the small stone bear that never left her person. It had become a talisman, not just of protection, but of possibility. A reminder that the most significant journeys often begin with the smallest steps of compassion. From the council gathering came the sound of Black Wolf's voice, strong and clear as he addressed his people and the representatives from neighboring settlements who had come to discuss trade agreements. His leadership had evolved over these years, just as Sarah had. They had learned from each other, challenged each other, supported each other through difficulties neither could have navigated alone. And somewhere in that journey, respect had deepened into something more, a connection neither had sought, but both had eventually embraced, to the delight of Ahiga and the cautious acceptance of their respective communities. Their union, formalized in ceremonies that honored both their traditions, stood as living proof of the bridges they had helped to build. Sarah took one more moment to herself before joining the council. She looked out over the landscape that had once been her solitary refuge and was now a thriving community. So much had changed in 3 years, so much had been lost and found and transformed. All because she had opened her door on a stormy night and chosen compassion over fear. With the stone bear warm in her palm and purpose in her heart, Sarah Holloway stepped off her porch to join the people who had become her family, not by blood, but by choice, by shared struggle, by the radical act of seeing humanity in those the world had taught her to fear. Behind her, the cabin door stood open, as it always did now. No longer a barrier against the world, but an invitation to all that might be possible when courage and compassion light the way forward.